Hello and welcome to another episode of Royal Service by Stephen Barry. I don't want this book to end. I just love it so much. Now, I didn't turn on live chat for this particular episode because this chapter is quite sad. It's about Lord Louis Mountbatten's assassination by the IRA, and I just thought maybe, live chat mightn't really fit the vibe, so I'll put it on next week again. Okay, so let's get stuck into this. Chapter 9, Royal Tragedy and Royal Security. On June 11th, 1981, Trooping the Colour took place on a glorious, hot and sunny day. It was also to prove a historic day, but I did not know that until the Prince came back to his Buckingham Palace apartment at 12:30 p.m. He handed me his sword and began wrenching at the gold buttons on the tunic. "Do you know what happened?" he asked. Now, Stephen Barry did not know what happened because after he helped the Prince on with his uniform, he began to pack up because the Prince was actually going off somewhere after Trooping the Colour, so he was getting ready to pack everything up that he needed. So he didn't sort of observe Trooping the Colour, he didn't hear anything about it. Assuming some guardsman had fainted, a fairly usual occurrence, I just said, "No, what happened?" "Some idiot fired shots at the Queen." "Oh my God," I said, shocked, and hesitated before asking tentatively, "Is everything all right?" "Fine, there were blanks as it happened." Now, this really shook up, understandably, the then Prince of Wales because, how vulnerable would you feel and how upset would you feel that your own mother had had shots fired at her? He shook his head. It makes one realise how vulnerable one can be. Indeed, the royal family are vulnerable. As the Prince himself frequently says, the possibility of assassination is just one of the risks of the job. But they were soon to find out just how vulnerable. On August 27, 1979, the royals' family vulnerability became a horrible fact. It was the most unhappy morning the entire time I worked for Prince Charles. His great-uncle, Lord Mountbatten, had been assassinated by the IRA, and I was sitting at Heathrow Airport waiting for the Prince to return from his fishing holiday in Iceland. A murderous blast from 50 pounds of explosive planted on board. Lord Mountbatten was killed instantly, along with the Prince's godson, 14-year-old Nicholas, and a 17-year-old boatman. Lord Mountbatten's daughter, Lady Brabourne, and her son Timothy were in a critical condition. The Dowager Lady Brabourne, who was 80, died later in hospital, and Lady Brabourne's husband John was also injured. Now, I'll read this little bit out verbatim because it's quite moving. "When the plane landed on the south side of the airport where all VIP landings are made, I went on board. The Prince was walking towards me from the rear of the plane, looking very pale and drawn, and already wearing a black tie. I always packed one wherever he went, never thinking it would actually be used. As he came towards me, I stammered, 'Your Royal Highness, I don't know what to say.' He just looked at me and said very quietly, 'What's the point?' There was no answer. Neither of us said any more. It was a silent drive to Windsor while the chauffeur threaded through the traffic. When we arrived at the castle, I unpacked the picnic lunch I'd brought from Buckingham Palace, and it was such a gloriously sunny day, he said, we might as well eat outside. He had a favourite spot in the gardens, and I settled him down there, and slowly he began to unwind as he sat quietly watching the swallows dart about the castle walls. "I hope this hasn't ruined your holiday," he said, as I unpacked lunch. "No, sir, I was actually going later this week." He was silent for a moment and then he said, "Well, it's very good of you to come." Then Stephen Barry asked him how he learnt the news, and evidently the British ambassador actually called him in Iceland, but initially he wasn't told that Lord Mountbatten had actually died. He was told that he'd been injured in an attack, but he thought he was still alive, and it wasn't until several hours later that he actually found that he had died. He said to Stephen Barry, "I felt immense gloom. The death of his godson Nicky had hit him almost as much as that of Lord Mountbatten. Such a waste of a young life. He was obviously deeply shocked and very unhappy, and during the 3 days I was with him before leaving for my holiday, he would go to London twice a day and collect lunch and dinner for him from Buckingham Palace and sort of bring it to him, and not talk to him all that much, but just, make sure that he had some companionship and that he was okay. He said one day, "I can't understand it. Why should anyone attack Lord Mountbatten, who had done only good? Why would he be attacked?" Now, we know more about Lord Louis Mountbatten now, of course. More has come out since the release of archives and letters and things like that. But the then Prince Charles would have had no idea of his other life, of his secret life. And Lady Brabourne, she was 80. His voice was absolutely despairing. As a compliment to his honorary grandfather, he said to me, when the funeral arrangements were being discussed, "I'm going to wear every decoration I'm permitted. Lord Mountbatten would have liked that." Before the funeral, on September the 5th, the Duke of Edinburgh, who had regarded Lord Mountbatten as his honorary father, flew down from Scotland, and he and the Prince went to Eastleigh Airport near Broadlands to wait for the return of the bodies. Can you imagine how upsetting that would have been? I mean, there's so many layers to this. He was a loved family member. He was an honorary grandfather to the then Prince Charles. He was an honorary father to Prince Philip. So they obviously had that very deep and abiding connection. But also that extra layer of fear by the fact that he was killed by an assassination attempt. Now, the rest of the royal family would have been thinking, is it our turn next? Are they going to go after us next? And even though I'm sure they didn't want to be too self-involved, it would have had to have crossed their minds. It would have to be a consideration. And of course, all their security at that point was really amped up, so they would have been very, very conscious of just how much potential danger they were in. Now, Stephen Barry says, "I never went to the funeral. I wish I had, but my own holiday had been arranged, the tickets bought, and the Prince insisted I went." The Prince had pondered the possibility of his own kidnapping, and he did say to me one day, "If I'm kidnapped, if I'm gone, I'm gone. I'd be delighted if anyone got me back, but no one should ever pay a ransom." And then Stephen Barry goes on to say that because they were more aware of the dangers, like I said earlier, security was really, really amped up. And he tells a lighter story where the Prince turned up unexpectedly at Royal Ascot, and he nearly got sort of barred from the course because the guy didn't know who he was. One Royal Ascot meeting during the Prince's naval days, when he was nearly barred from the course, he was stationed at Portsmouth, and having managed to get away early, decided he would go up to Ascot and see the family and their guests. Not having time to get to Windsor Castle, he headed straight for the course and went by the Golden Gates to wave at the Queen as she passed by in her carriage. As he was waiting, an official saw the distant figure and shouted, "Hey, you can't stand there." And the Prince shouted back, "But it's me." "I don't care who you are," said the official, coming closer. "You can't stand there." Suddenly, it dawned on the poor man, to whom he'd just refused entry, and he retreated with a lot of bowing. "I needn't have waited anyway," the Prince later told me. "They all went by in the carriage and looked the other way." So they didn't even see him anyway. All that effort for nothing, and he even got yelled at. So Stephen Barry then goes on to tell us about his policeman, who we've heard of quite frequently before. "When I worked for the Prince, he had a team of 3 policemen, but the 2 most senior of them at the time was John Maclean and Paul Officer. Now, Paul Officer did not get on with Princess Diana, and he left the day of the wedding. But John Maclean, who was due for retirement in 1983, stayed the course, and he said even if John Maclean was dressed up in white tie, he still looked like a policeman. You could tell from a mile off that he was a policeman, even if he was really dressed up. The Prince said he's a handy man to have in a fight." And then Stephen Barry says, "Though I don't believe either of them ever had one." But they did. Stephen Barry's forgotten, because I think it was John Maclean that actually helped protect him that time he was attacked on his minesweeper. Remember, I think that was in Royal Secrets. I might be making that up. Maybe it wasn't John Maclean. Maybe it was another officer. Might have been another officer. Balmoral is one of the few places where Prince Charles could really go walking, and the chances of someone springing at him from a bush are remote. He has the habit of wanting those around him to share what he enjoys, so he took Stephen Barry stalking with him. "No need to take the car," he said as we walked, and we walked, and we walked, and we walked. By the end of the day, I could see him striding further ahead in the growing dusk. At one point, he must have been a mile in front of me, and I was beginning to get rather nervous. We were stuck in the middle of nowhere, and I was thinking, I'll never make it home, as he plunged deeper and deeper into the moorland. Eventually, he waited and let him catch up. But I assure you, even a fit terrorist would have had trouble stalking him in the countryside. He knows so well. A lot of the royal security is unseen, and he goes on to say about all the panic buttons around the place. And of course, remember in Housekeeper's Diary where Princess Diana accidentally kicked one of the panic buttons in the bedroom when they were making passionate love, and the policeman stormed into the bedroom, and then Prince Charles was absolutely furious that they stormed in. Don't blame him, do you? Don't blame him. Indeed, bells are a great feature of royal life. Most palace staff are summoned by them. We used to say that the first thing the nanny teaches a royal is how to ring for services. Now, it's funny because he had a little bell that was hidden underneath his desk, and if he was in a meeting that he wanted to get out of, he used to just surreptitiously just press this little bell, and then Stephen Barry would come in, and then the prince would say, "Oh my gosh, Stephen, is that the time?" And then he would stand up and say, "I'm so sorry, I have another appointment. I had no idea it was so late." He tells a rather disturbing thing that in 1978, the prince was driving through the moorland in Scotland on his way back to Balmoral, where he saw a girl deep in the countryside thumbing a lift, and he stopped because he just assumed that she was lost. She turned out to be some sort of student, he told me, as he's preparing for dinner, so I just took her back to the main road and dropped her off. A year went by, and he was coming back from Balmoral Castle again. "Can you believe it?" he said. "I saw the same girl thumbing a lift. I stopped, and it was exactly the same one as last year." "You were set up," I told him. "The lady obviously had her timing down to a fine art." Now, it goes on to say a really lovely thing just to finish off this chapter. The job of guarding the prince is very much sought after in the police force. The reason is simple. Because he's the most pleasant royal to work for. He's easygoing, he cares about his staff, and he likes people. Now, he goes on to say that Princess Anne's staff turnover was enormous when she was young. It's not now, because she used to lose her temper and shout, and they simply would not stay with her. And Prince Andrew tended to be the same. Anne really matured a lot, didn't she? And I think she's a lot happier in her second marriage. I think a lot of the yelling and the more bad behaviour when she was younger was the fact that she was stuck in an unhappy marriage. I'm convinced of it. But now she's really happy because she's genuinely in love and they get on really well and they're a really good partnership. "The royals, I'm afraid," said Stephen Barry, "are birds in gilded cages." All right, time for another chapter. Now, this one's a little bit lighter, thank goodness, because there's not assassinations and all that sort of thing. So chapter 10, A Prince of Wit and Warmth. The strongest word I've heard the Prince of Wales use was bloody. I never heard him utter a 4-letter word in the 12 years I worked for him, nor does he go around kicking the furniture or throwing things. That sort of behaviour is simply not his style. Now, I think that was a little bit of a dig back at Princess Diana, because stuff was starting to leak around the time this book came out. Stuff was starting to leak about the prince, and a lot of it was really negative. A lot of it was implying that he had this raging huge temper, that he used to throw things and all that sort of thing. And this is a clear rebuttal of that. A clear rebuttal. Now, of course, we don't know, because Stephen Barry obviously really thinks very much of the then Prince of Wales and regards him as someone very close to him. So he may have just been defending him out of loyalty. But it seems to ring true. I don't know. I know Prince Charles has got a temper, but I don't know whether he's really the throwing things type of person. You let me know down below what you think. One thing that makes him very tight-lipped is smoking. He cannot abide it. His car has no ashtray, so if people say, "May I smoke?" he says, "Of course." And then he says, "But I'm so sorry, there's no ashtrays." I remember one evening when we were in Yellowknife in northwest Canada attending a big political dinner. 400 people were in an overheated banqueting room while outside the temperature was sub-zero. The Prince had particularly asked our host, the Commissioner for the Northwest Territories, to request that no one smoke until after the royal toast. When eventually the toastmaster said, "To Her Majesty the Queen," there was an audible sigh of relief. All that could be heard were handbags opening, cigarette packet paper rustling, matches striking and lighters clicking. The room looked like a torchlit parade, and the Prince looked horrified. If smoking annoys him, tardiness truly angers him. He loathes being kept waiting. So being kept waiting by Catherine and Prince William for the coronation probably drove him mad. Now, he goes on to say that he never walked anywhere. He was always rushing here and there. He was always he'd run at a great pace. And one day he'd gone for a swim and he was rushing back. And he did have a suit and tie on, but he was running back to his room. So I guess he didn't look very dignified. And someone was staying with him. It was actually the president of Zaire. And out of a room popped a black gentleman, one of the president's entourage, who stopped him and he said, "You press," he demanded, and he thrust a bundle of clothing into the Prince's hand. And the Prince of Wales said, "Certainly, sir," and without missing a beat, took off down the corridor until he found a footman to pass them on to. Then when he got back into his room, he said to Stephen Barry, "Guess what happened? I nearly got your job." Now, the main thing he says when people keep him waiting is he gets quite cross and he says, "I don't know why I bother." Another one he says is, "The things I do for England." And he says that sometimes he has to eat some quite disgusting things, like he's eaten and drunk some very strange things in different parts of the world: raw liver, blubber in the Arctic regions, snake in Hong Kong, and some rather questionable cocktails in Africa. He's even tolerant about some of the poorer food he's served at the palace. He just lifts the cover, sniffs at it and says, "Oh, anything for a peaceful life." So he won't complain, Basically, he's a contented person, happy with his lot and his position. Considering the restrictions on his life and the fact that he's the future king, he really is rather nice. He enjoys being who he is, he loves his family and his job, and he performs his duty cheerfully most of the time. He only pulls a long face when he's tired. And he used to ask Stephen Barry if he'd seen, a recent film that had been at the cinema. And if Stephen Barry had, he always used to say, "Well, would I like it?" And Stephen Barry said, "Well, I think you might, sir." And if that was the case, then the then Prince Charles would order it to be sent up to Balmoral, and in their summer holidays they would sit and watch it in the movie room. One day he asked Stephen Barry quite wistfully, "Do you ever go to nightclubs?" he asked once. "No, sir, I do not," I told him. "I can't afford to." He looked thoughtful. "Yes, I suppose the cost of going out must be very high," he said. He's good at hiding boredom, but he does fall asleep quite a lot, usually at private dinners. People who know him well know that he likes to nod off, and the lady sitting next to him, usually the hostess, will carry on talking as if he's absolutely fascinated by her conversation. There's even been occasions when the hostess hasn't realised that 40 winks were being grabbed. Then he wakes up, refreshed, bright and cheerful, and carries on talking as if nothing has happened. That would be rather disconcerting if you were talking to the prince, because you couldn't help feeling that maybe you were boring him. Another saying of his was, "If you're cold, put on a pullover," because as we know, Prince Charles and now King Charles can't stand overheated rooms. He's always going, throwing open the windows and letting chilly air blow in, and evidently Queen Camilla's always going up behind him and closing them again for the benefit of everybody else in the room. Power cuts never disturb the royals in the slightest. The prince puts on an extra pullover and the queen sits tranquilly at her desk, wearing her mink coat to work. Power cuts are just another temporary crisis, a little discomfort to enjoy. And that's harking back to the last week episode where he says that anything that was out of the ordinary, anything that was sort of a bit uncomfortable, used to thrill the royals because they used to enjoy the break in their routine. Now, he said a rather sweet thing, that children and schools write and send in drawings, and years ago a child sent him a marvellous drawing of the Prince of Wales, and drew him as a whale wearing a crown. I'm not sure that's very complimentary, but anyway, the Prince absolutely loved it. Stephen Barry said he was really enchanted by it, and he had it framed, and it now hangs in his bathroom. Isn't that lovely? Imagine the child that actually painted that, because they would know who it was. They would know if it was them. Imagine when they read this book, possibly, many years later, and they realised that the Prince had framed his actual painting and put it up in his bathroom. Now, he says the thing about his bachelor days. He says he now sees less of his friends than he did. In the old days before the princess came along, he would say, "Stephen, we have 6 coming for drinks and afterwards we're going on for dinner." And he'd often arrange after theatre supper parties, and he would be busy, seeing his friends. But then he said a lot of his friends married and settled down and had children, and he became more isolated. Well, that's just a fact of life for all of us. I mean, once your friends start getting married off and start having kids, you just don't see them as much. And if you're the last one to get married, well, you do really feel it. So I guess he's like all of us in that situation. But I wonder whether that even encouraged him even more to actually propose to Lady Diana Spencer. Maybe it wasn't just pressure from his father. Maybe it was the fact that all his friends had actually gone ahead and done it and married and had children. Now, he says that he was quite disorganised because often he would book the royal box for the opera, and then he would forget that he'd done that, and then he'd forget that he needed to have invited friends to accompany him, because you can't book the whole royal box and then have no one with you. So, Stephen Barry would be scrambling, trying to find friends available of the princes that loved opera, because he didn't want to, have people come out of obligation. He had a few set friends that would come along, but when he couldn't make up the numbers, he used to invite Lady Susan Hussey, the Queen's lady-in-waiting, who would be dragged along to fill up the box. Not that she minded, because she too loved opera, but most of the prince's friends aren't that keen. He had a real soft spot for Lady Susan Hussey. She was always visiting him in his private rooms and having afternoon tea with him. They got on very well. We always took dinner with us. Now listen to this. This is something else. Behind the box there was a small dining room, and little did the audience realise what's going on. For 2 hours, footmen had been in the theatre laying out silver, beautiful glassware and linen. When they've finished, the table looks like one from the palace. Not surprising, as everything had been actually brought from the palace. When the first intermission comes, the prince takes his party through the door at the back of the box and into the dining room, and then they sit down for the first and main course. Now, Stephen Barry's main job was to listen for the 5-minute bell and to give the prince warning. And then at the 2-minute bell, knives and forks had to be put down, lights were turned off in the back dining room so that when they re-entered the royal box, they wouldn't disturb anyone else in the audience. In the second interval, pudding and coffee were served, and at that point the principal singers from the opera would come up and take a cup of coffee with him. He rarely missed a Joan Sutherland performance. She always popped up to see him in full stage regalia. Another favourite is Placido Domingo. Twice a year, in June and December, he holds a meeting with his office to plan the next 6 months' engagements. Whenever he stays anywhere, the local vicar would ring to ask if he was going to be in church, and this is what he would say: "I can pray while I'm fishing, but I can't fish in church." So the answer would be no. He says something interesting about Prince Edward. Evidently, Prince Edward's really into fishing, fly fishing as well. Prince Edward is following in the prince's waders. He likes to fish. Prince Andrew shows no interest whatsoever. Edward and Andrew are chalk and cheese. Edward is more like Prince Charles. They have a lot in common, the same basically easygoing temperament, and they're both gentle people. That's nice to know, isn't it? I wonder whether they still go fishing together ever. Another of his less grown-up habits was throwing bread rolls at barbecues. I remember he once neatly wrapped a bap, a soft Scottish bread roll, around Lady Tryon's face. She didn't seem to mind, being one of the ladies in his circle who wasn't remotely stuffy, but then few people voice a criticism of what the Prince of Wales chooses to do. That intrigues me, that whole story about Lady Tryon and the fact that she was Australian. But there's so many sort of little stories about the fact that they were actually romantically entwined way before Diana, when he was firmly a bachelor. And before she married Lord Tryon, there was a bit of a romance, evidently. I've heard it continued after her marriage, but I have no definitive proof. When he needed a haircut, I rang up Mr. Willison from Trufferton Hill in Jerram Street and asked him to come over. It would be either when the Prince was getting up in the morning or in the evening before he dressed for dinner. He worked on the principle that if he was going to get his shirt messed up with bits of hair, he might as well get the job done when he's going to have a change anyway. And then the hairdresser actually instructed Stephen Barry how to do it, so that when they were away on tour, a really long tour, Stephen Barry would be able to cut his hair. And Stephen Barry said that there was a lot of criticism in those days about Prince Charles's haircuts and hairstyles, and he'd think he might be to blame. Now, Prince Charles doesn't go for champagne, and every time he's away somewhere on tour, invariably he would go into the room and there would be a bottle of champagne on ice. So he used to make the policeman and Stephen Barry have a glass so it wouldn't be rude for the hostess. He loves cold fishy dishes and he loathes any form of chocolate pudding. And he said that once he was in Tasmania, now I don't know who this chef was, but Stephen Barry and John McLean went down to the kitchen to check on what was happening, so they could sort of forewarn the Prince if there was anything that he didn't like. And they called her the Julia Child of Australia, cooking away very pleased of herself. Now, I have no idea who they would be referring to, the Julia Child of Australia. Let me know down below if you have any idea who that might be. I don't know who it might be. John looked at me and I looked at him as she was making a wonderful looking chocolate mousse. I hadn't the heart to say anything. Then suddenly she took a great handful of nuts and smothered the pudding with him. Another thing the Prince can't abide is nuts. So they go back upstairs and Stephen Barry teased him and said, "You're going to love the pudding." He looked at me suspiciously. "What is it?" "Well, oh, not chocolate. It's chocolate with nuts." And the Prince goes, "Oh, God." I was able to warn him, though, so his face wouldn't drop. When the chocolate mousse was produced, he managed a bright smile. "Oh, lovely," he said, "chocolate mousse. But just the tiniest amount, please. The first course was so good, I haven't got a lot of room left." Oh, isn't he kind? How lovely. His idea of cooking was grilling steaks and making bread and butter puddings, which he really does like. We used to have to eat vast quantities of it, otherwise it would be served over and over again. And that's a running theme throughout this book, that the Prince does not like wasting anything. Anything that wasn't eaten the day before would be served the next day. Now, when Diana actually moved into Highgrove, that did change a bit because she had more sophisticated tastes and she realised that they couldn't keep serving leftovers, particularly to guests, for lunch. There was a real sense of family closeness, and it probably explains the royal fascination with barbecues and picnics. It's impossible to be formal and royal when eating out of doors, frequently in some discomfort, but they do let others join in occasionally. Now, he says at a formal dinner that over the first two courses, he talks to whoever is on his right, and over pudding and coffee, he turns to the left, which is very handy information because I always wondered if I went to a formal dinner, which side. I knew that you spoke to one side over the entree and the main, and then you switched for pudding and coffee and all of that. I knew that, but I didn't know which side you started on. So now I know. Now I know. I guess I could have observed everyone else at the table. I would have been all right. Actually, every formal dinner I've ever gone to, it's been on a round table. So it hasn't actually been that stressful because everybody tended to talk to everybody else across the table, even though it was a formal dinner. Another favourite story that improves with the telling happened just before Princess Anne married the then Lieutenant Phillips. The prince had gone for a ride along, which is called the Long Walk, a 3-mile ride on the Windsor estate. He'd stopped and was sitting looking out over the view when a small boy appeared. Parking himself by the horse's head, he said, "Hi, are you Lieutenant Phillips?" The prince looked down at him. "No, sorry." And the child just gave a really disappointed shrug and walked off. "Well, all right then," he said, and walked despondently back down the hill. One day, when the police had all been given a raise by the government, he said to John Maclean, "Well, how much do you earn now?" And John Maclean said, "I'm not going to tell you that, sir." And the prince said, "Oh, come on, tell me. Is it as much as a captain or a major in the army?" John, whose rank was chief inspector, nearly choked. He had a strong suspicion, without knowing, that majors probably earned a good deal more. "I'm not sure, sir," he said. "I don't know what the army's paid." Joining the conversation, I said thoughtfully, "Perhaps I should ask for a pay rise." And John, anxious to change the subject, said, "You'd better see your shop steward about that." And then the prince chimed in, "I'm his shop steward and he can't have one." Oh. But afterwards, he looked into what I was earning and I did get a small raise. His Scottish meanness, as he himself called it, is always in conflict with his natural generosity. And that's the end of the chapter. So the next chapter, chapter 11, is courting danger. So maybe we're not out of the woods yet. Thank you so much for joining me. It's so much fun to read this book and share it with you. And I love reading all your comments. I'll see you again next time. Bye.